Hello, my name is Damian Burks, and I'm a part of the UK Information Security Team. And today I'll be covering the Cyber Operations and Risk Management briefing presentation for the Global Economic Summit. Alrighty, so for the agenda for this presentation, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to cover the software development lifecycle. Then we're going to talk about the software assurance expectations that we have, along with the current infrastructure debrief. Following that, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about our current SDLC methodology and concerns that we have, and then we'll move into the supply chain risks. Once we cover the supply chain risks, then we're going to talk about the current threats and vulnerabilities. Then we'll move into the supply chain options or option, as well as then following that, we'll cover the software options and the SDLC options, and then we'll end it with the recommendations and the cost benefit analysis. Okay, so let's talk about the software development lifecycle overview. So, what exactly is or does the software development lifecycle mean? What is defined as the SDLC? So, the SDLC is pretty much a big picture breakdown of all the steps that is involved in software creation process. So, when software is created, the first phase that it has to go through is the planning phase, then it moves to the analysis phase. Then from the analysis, they move into the design phase, then they start the implementation phase. Once the implementation phase is complete, then they move into the testing and integration phase, and then it ends with the maintenance phase, which is step six. And generally, within a software development lifecycle or an SDLC, there are 5 to 7 phases that are included in them. So following the SDLC overview, let's talk about our software assurance expectations that we have for our current software. So exactly what is software assurance? So the Department of Defense in the United States defines or refers to software assurance as the level of confidence in which a particular piece of software functions as intended and is completely secure throughout the entire software development lifecycle or SDLC. So right now, what we must ensure that, or we expect that all of the software that we have within our for the Global Economic Summit follows the following security regulations that they have or standards, such as the United States National Institute of Standards and Technology (NIST) Cybersecurity Framework. There's the Internal Organization for Standardization, 2700 series of standards. There's the Center for Internet Security, CIS 20 controls. There's also GDPR, or the European Union's General Data Protection Regulation, and we also want to ensure that we are incorporating procedures and processes for the UK Data Protection Act 2018. So now that we know the software assurance expectations that we have, let's cover the current infrastructure that we have already for the Global Economic Summit. So if you take a look at the image on the right, that's basically an architecture diagram that is designed by our information security professionals and engineers that highlights all of the moving pieces of the Global Economic Summits network. So our current infrastructure at this time is made up of the following resources. So we do have data centers. We are connected to data centers in both Liverpool and in London, but the core pieces that I want to focus on is that we have Windows 10 virtual machines deployed that allows our government employees to be able to leverage and perform their day-to-day tasks, as well as the Ubuntu virtual machines. And we also have WordPress application servers and also a cluster of MySQL databases deployed in this environment as well. So now that we know what our current infrastructure looks like, let's take a look at the SDLC methodology and concerns that we have. So right now, our current SDLC method that we're using or we're following is the waterfall model. So the pros and cons of the waterfall model is that the pros, it focus on a clear and defined set of steps, and the structure is very simple. So when we iterate through these SDLC, we're following one step at a time or one phase at a time inside of that SCLC. So in that respect, or in that in regarding that, we must complete at least or at we must complete a step at a time before we move on to the next, or one phase before we move on to the next. And it also determines the end goal early, and we're able to transfer that information well to our stakeholders and whatnot. Some cons, however, is that it makes changes difficult if we need to make changes on the fly, or if there's a change that is that management is requiring us to do to develop a feature. Is going to make things changes difficult in that regard. And it also excludes the client and or end user and delays testing until after completion, and that's unfortunate. As far as the assurance expectations and concerns go, right now we know that with the waterfall model or method, there are high amounts of risk and uncertainty, and it's not a good model for complex and object-oriented projects. So it is a poor model for long and ongoing projects, and it is also not suitable for projects where requirements are at a moderate to high risk of changing, right? And in the security world or in the industry, there are most likely going to be a lot of requirements that are going to change as we move forward throughout the various different phases of the SDLC. Okay, so moving on to supply chain risk. So since the majority of our infrastructure is heavily relying on commercial off-the-shelf software, we run the risk of being compromised by supply chain threats, right? So the current threats that we run the risk of being compromised through are third-party vendor risk, which are inherited risks from vendors. So this could be pre-existing vulnerabilities that are included in devices and applications like your CPUs, and WordPress application bundles and the extensions that come with them. There are also digital risks and threats. So these are ways for cyber criminals to get into your overall infrastructure. So malware through malware infection and also intellectual property theft as well. And then you also have supplier fraud. So supplier fraud is when the cyber criminal pretty much impersonates a known retailer and requests to change their payment processes and stuff like that. So this typically happens with advanced social engineering attacks and techniques, and also phishing attacks, which is pretty much a category underneath social engineering. So now we'll talk about our current threats and vulnerabilities after we talked about the supply chain risks. So based on research that are conducted by our team from previous events that have happened at the Global Economic Summit or prior to the Global Economic Summit, our infrastructure is susceptible to the following threats. So we have web application attacks and cross-site scripting attack. Cross-site scripting is a type of attack in which the attacker attaches code onto a legitimate website, which means ours, that will execute and when the victim loads that website and whatnot. So there's just one attack vector that I know that we're susceptible to. Another thing is that we're susceptible to social engineering attacks, phishing attacks specifically. So this is where the attacker will attempt to trick the user into revealing their personal information, and they can do this via email, via phone. There are a plethora of ways in which they can social engineer someone. And then we also have ransomware attacks, which is an ever evolving type of malware that is designed to pretty much encrypt files on a device and pretty much render the all any of those files and that system unusable by someone. So as we come to try to conclude this presentation, we're going to start getting into talking about the various options that we have. So the first thing is that we want to talk about the supply chain option, which is pretty much implemented supply chain policy, right? So there are several best practices that we could follow in order to mitigate supply chain attacks and threats via implementing and enforcing a policy. So according to the National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST, we should create a one strike and you're out policy with respect to vendor products that are either counterfeit or don't match specifications that we've researched. In addition to that, we should also implement a new software development lifecycle called the Security Software Development Lifecycle Program, and then train our developers and also our users on that program. All source code that is obtained, we want to make sure that we've purchased that source code. And we also want to ensure that we are tracking and tracing those programs to establish the provenance of all parts, components, and systems that we have. So pretty much keeping inventory of all systems, applications, et cetera, within our environment. All right, so let's move into our software options. So right now we're just pretty much going to emphasize the need or the options for just our web application server softwares. So the first thing is that let's talk about the migration type. So we have three of them. So the first migration type is to hire developers to create those in-house solutions for the Global Economic Summit. So there are some pros and cons that are associated with that. So let's get right into it. So the pro is the organization has full control and visibility over what is being developed. And they can also create custom applications and tools for key use cases. This also can be really good for security purposes if you want to enforce certain standards and protocols. You can easily implement those features yourselves or have your engineering teams do it for you. One of the cons is that it can be extremely costly because it requires, hiring the correct staff and engineers, project managers and managers, and other stakeholders getting invested into it to be able to design, architect, and implement those solutions. So if we migrate from WordPress to Drupal, right? Um, Unlike WordPress, Drupal is pretty much a similar tool where it is high performing and fast when loading those websites. And it is also known to be one of the most secure content management platforms available. And that's pretty much due to their newly designed and implemented access management features and also the lack of extensions that are third part or lack of third party extensions. And one cool thing to note is that the White House website is utilizing Drupal. So that's one thing that we found in our research. One of the cons is that the lack of extensions make it hard to accommodate feature requests, so we have to keep that in mind. And it's a bit more expensive than WordPress, but it's more secure, so something to keep in mind as well. So if we wanted to migrate WordPress to Squarespace as a platform as a service solution, the organization who developed Squarespace, the Squarespace organization, manages this security task and contains a plethora of security features. In addition, it's easy to use it for website building and offer analytics and also for tracking and so on and so forth. One of the cons is that, you know, unlike WordPress, Squarespace offers very limited control and flexibility for developing those websites. So you lose the flexibility for creating new features and incorporating like third-party extensions or even building your own with WordPress. So you lose the customization ability with WordPress if you were to move to Squarespace. All right, for the SDLC options, we have three different types that we've evaluated. So we have the Agile Software Development Method, the Rapid Application Development Method, and also the Feature-Driven Development Method. So starting with the agile software development method first. So some pros is that it's flexible and it allows for flexible and modifiable goals for folks to be able to quickly adapt and create new features and deploy them into an existing framework or application. Some cons is that it's a very hands-on approach, so it really involves a lot of stakeholders at the beginning in every phase of the life cycle. So if you prefer to step back and let the process work for itself, it definitely is not the methodology that we should incorporate, right? Um, with the rapid application development method, some pros is that the requirements can be changed at any time, and it also encourages and prioritizes customer feedback. So it allows reviews to get done quicker. Deployments are done a lot faster, and then also time between prototypes is very short. Some cons is that, of course, you need to be able to have a lot of collaboration going on over communication, and it doesn't really work with large teams, and you really need highly skilled, trained engineers and developers in order for this to be able to work for the organization, right, or for the Global Economic Summit. And then with feature-driven development, some pros of that is that you have a focused scope and there are early and frequent delivery. You get improved communication if you incorporate this and also increase flexibility and better project management because you're developing things um, feature-based, right? So it's very iterative. The cons is that there's a lot of complexity, dependencies, and you also have limited visibility and control over the entire scope of the project because you're just focusing on that particular feature or a list of features. So, some software assurance concerns that we have for all three. When we go back to agile software development, as it is one of the most tried and true development methods, but it doesn't come without its own set of safety and security risk in software development. So the problem is that with agile development, you can experience lack of process documentation, inadequate security training and awareness because we're moving so quickly, and you can also experience a failure to manage that sensitive data, right? So a lot of things can be overlooked with agile software development. Under rapid application development, you can run into data storage issues, weak encryption, and data leakages. And then with feature-driven development, you can run into the same thing, which is lost data, loss of reputation, and also loss of customers' confidence, and so on and so forth. So, um, a lot of the impacts for all three really revolves around, lack of process, lack loss of data, and so many different things that can really impact the environment in a very negative way. So, as we start to come to the close of this presentation, let's leave off with some recommendations, right? So, based on our current environment and vulnerabilities that we've discussed, we will need to incorporate the following changes. So, the first thing that we need to do is let's go ahead and let's modify the current SDLC that we have, waterfall, and leverage the agile methodology. And then the next thing that we will need to do is create and implement a supply chain risk management policy that closely aligns with the NIST standards that we said earlier in our presentation for the supply chain options. The third thing that we need to do is let's migrate from WordPress and create our own in-house web application hosting solution so that we can control what kind of features that we've developed and we push out, and we also have everything will be fully managed by us and our engineers. For our IDS and IPS, let's go ahead and start creating new rules to detect and prevent malware and ransomware attacks that are coming through the network and being transmitted there. We also want to ensure that we're enforcing strong password policies with multi-factor authentication for our employees. And the last thing is that we want to implement cybersecurity awareness training for social engineering and phishing attacks so that employees can do their due diligence and help improve the security hygiene of the Summit's network. Okay, so now that we've gone over the recommendations, let's talk about the cost benefit analysis of if we were to incorporate these recommendations, right? So the costs, we have implementation costs. So the implementation costs, we'll need to make sure that we have new engineering team members and management staff to allow for the development of those in-house solutions. We most likely will need new infrastructure and environments for new solution development. So this could be server, this could be development software, et cetera, et cetera. We'll also need to have new training software and content for social engineering and the secure SDLC. We'll also need to uh, have infrastructure upgrades to meet new policy enforcement and the management and compliance and a new management and compliance team for licensing and vendor relationships so that we can keep uh, control or monitor our licenses and also any type of vulnerabilities or threats that we may have from a supply chain standpoint. The cost benefits of these if we were to invest into these things. So we'll be more agile and more responsive to any security threats that we have from and vulnerabilities that we have. We'll also minimize the threat landscape and existing vulnerabilities that we already have in place. Uh, Enhance employee security awareness for social engineering, and will also increase their knowledge on the agile SDLC. We'll also have the ability to control and adjust in-house software and applications to meet any new security requirements that we have. And as mentioned before, decrease supply chain risk and attacks. Do we have any questions so far? Alrighty, if there are no questions, thank you guys so much for listening and you have a great one.